oversold Windsor. Why would they do that? That's mean. Okay. Wait, I need to go back a couple slides. Okay, so today, really important reminder, if you are in the first of the two labs, right, you have a lab Tuesday between 2 and 4. It is today, like we're going to have it today. It's in Torrey basement, so TB 39. I'm assuming if you've been here a few years, you know the difference between all the different buildings in Torrey, but TB 39 downstairs. So be there at 2 o'clock. I think Celine will be there. I have to go talk to her, but I think she got her contract. I don't know where the money came from, but that's not really my problem. So lab, and then if you are in the lab on Wednesdays, 3 till 5, that is tomorrow as well. Same room, TB 39, and yeah, so Celine should be teaching that one as well. Okay. Namaste. Sorry, it's like run all the way over here, almost die. I'm not in shape to do this apparently. And now I'm like, calm down and teach. Find the Zen within you. Talk about research questions. At least it's a boring topic, so it's soothing, right? I'm kidding. Research questions are so interesting. Okay, so we ended off last time, we were talking about research questions, right? And basically what a research question looks like, and I think we ended off on this slide, right? We suggested a good research question, layman's terms, like a really good research question should be written in such a way that, you know, just a regular Joe, more or less, or a non-specialist should be able to understand what you're trying to figure out, right? Especially if you get to the point where you are sending your research proposals off to, say, SSHRC, you'll always have a non-specialist on the panel judging it. So SSHRC is the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council. They're the ones who give out the great big research grants at the master's, PhD, and beyond level. So, you know, if you go on to a master's, you'll inevitably be applying for it. And you have to research question. It has to be one that's understandable. It has to be researchable. I talked about this, right? You have to make sure the scope of the project is doable, especially in the time frame that you want to do it, right? So can you theoretically complete the research in the time allotted, right? If you're doing a master's, can you do it in basically a year? If you're doing a PhD, can you do it in, 5 to eternity years? And then like if you're applying for a 7-year grant, is it possible, right? Those kinds of things are all really important. Yeah, related in some ways to other research, right? It should have some kind of relation to the field, right? So you should be able to anchor it in the field, and neither too narrow or too broad, right? You don't want things to be so tiny in terms of scope that people look at it and they're like, who cares? Or too big that it's like, well, that's, a life's work, right? Okay, and that's kind of where we left off last time. Okay, sorry, I'm still a little out of breath. So, formulating a research question. Super fun, right? So, basically your research orientation, your epistemology on ontology, your design, what you think you're going to do, and the method in which you're going to gather your data have to match the kind of research you want to do, right? The research question that you formulate, right? So you couldn't, formulate a research question that, is like, what is it like to be a furry? Okay. Like, what is the experience of a furry like as they navigate through society? Okay. But you wouldn't then be like, I'm going to do a survey, right? I'm going to survey the whole population. I'm going to do a national survey of 5,000 Canadians in order to get a representative sample, because that method wouldn't make any sense for what you're trying to do, right? Because you're trying to get people's experiences in a relatively niche group, right? Okay, so some things that you might want to think about as you formulate a research question is what you're describing a brand new phenomenon. And this actually becomes a really interesting and difficult question because I remember going back and forth with PhD supervisors about this. And, it was like you wanted to locate your research question in what's called a gap in the literature, right? Something that people haven't necessarily talked about a lot. Now, one of the things my supervisor warned me was that, if you find that your research question is focused on something that you can't find any corresponding literature to, either you're in very, very new territory and that could be interesting, or you've wandered so far afield that your research question doesn't make sense because there's, no one has research in that area because it's either impossible or it's not interesting, right? It's so niche that it might be kind of completely uninteresting. Okay, so I'll give you an example. I don't know if this will help or not. Right now, I'm working on a paper basically on what's happened to the Russian TV industry since basically Russia's media industries were cut off from the international system, right? Because with the sanctions, because of the invasion of Ukraine, basically what happened was that all the big media companies in the West and Asia basically got cut off because they can't transfer money between Russia and other banks in other parts of the world through SWIFT. So, it's like Russian TV is now sort of cut off and on its own. It can't show Hollywood movies or Western TV shows or anything like that. Now, this is an interesting and I think new phenomenon precisely because it's never happened before. We've never had a highly integrated media system all of a sudden cut off from the global ecosystem and kind of what happens. So I think that's interesting. I think it'll be new. However, there is also no literature on it. And so part of my fear is, I don't know, maybe that's not that interesting. And it will be hard to construct, and this is what I'm struggling with actually, kind of a literature review and assessing kind of what the field has to say about this, because there's literally no literature on deglobalization of media, because for 60 years it's all been about globalization of media. Anyway, so in that case, I found a brand new phenomenon. I think it's interesting. I'm still working on gathering literature and figuring out what it looks like and gathering data. But in a lot of cases, you might stumble into, thinking that you want to research something and it's just so niche, there's no literature on it, that it might not actually be something that's viable as a research project. I can't tell if your hand's up or you're just leaning on that. Okay, I have it in my peripheral vision, so when I turn around, it kind of looks like an arm up, so I just wanted to be sure. Okay. Okay, measuring impact. Like how impactful is your project going to be, right? This was what my supervisor always described as the so what factor, right? Is there a so what to your question, right? So, you go through and you do your research project on, the Instagram use of teenage girls in Northeast Edmonton schools. The thing that you kind of have to think about is, and I might put this comment on your, as you write research questions, like, so what, right? So what's going to be the so what of this project? Like, why is this important? How is it going to, address a gap in literature or a gap in our knowledge in a way that's meaningful, right? And this is why I like, last time I was making jokes about autoethnography, where you which is basically kind of like telling the story of your own life. And I'm like, yes, who cares? Like, not to put too fine a point on it, but, I also have life experiences that are unique to me. So what? I've never been able to figure out the so what factor in something like autoethnography. I'm a little old school in terms of research methods. Your worldview, in what way in particular is your worldview affecting the question you're asking and all of that stuff? Were you trying to park in Windsor also? Honestly, it took me 35 minutes to park, and I have a pass. Good. Grumpy. I swear to God, I'm going to go park in the president's stall and just be like, well, I'm sorry, you oversold the parking. Yeah. I'm sure that'll turn out well for me. Yeah, my car got towed, but why? Okay, and hypothesis testing. Is your research question going to be able to allow you to test a hypothesis, right? Do you have a hypothesis, especially if you're looking at a quantitative research question? Is the question well tuned to addressing the particular hypothesis that you have about what you're going to find? Parking problems?
No.
Okay, I had parking problems, so now I feel great sympathy for. Did you run? Yeah, I also ran. I'm sweating so much. I'm gonna go have a chat with the president. That's what I'm gonna do. Where's his office again? Okay, I'm sure that'll go well. Okay, Yeah, so choice of research method, you need to make sure that it matches your research question. So like I was saying, you don't want to try to think of using a survey to deal with like really personal experiences that people have. You have to think about the scale. Are you asking like a large group kind of question, right? That you can't, the opinions of a large group would matter, or the experiences of a large group would matter? Or are you more kind of, wanting to get deep kind of knowledge about a small group, right? And we'll look at this when we talk about research design in a couple of seconds, right? So yeah, you want to make sure that you have the right kind of approach and the right methodology. And this whole class, right, is going to be all about like introducing you to a bunch of different methodologies so you can sort of think through and kind of pick one, right? I will say the big ones in sociology are surveys or questionnaires and interviews or focus groups, right? Those are the two biggest kind of methodologies. The surveys and questionnaires is on the quantitative side, and interviews and focus groups are on the qualitative side. There are other ones, right? But those are the two big ones. Okay, so I think for the most part, you're in safe and navigable waters if you propose something using either of those, and you can tailor your research question to it. Right. So research questions. What social factors make people enjoy smoking marijuana? Now, this would likely be quite difficult to do in a quantitative way, right? Like you probably could do a drug use survey where you try to create questions that are going to, try to understand the social factors around, say, people who smoke marijuana. It's not impossible. There's a couple problems with it in terms of if you try to create a questionnaire, right, and you're sending out surveys and trying to figure out who smokes marijuana. So you have a screening question at the top that's like, hey, do you smoke marijuana? And then you try to figure out what the factors are. That inherently is going to be affected by your bias in the kind of questions you ask and what you already think the factors might be, and you might miss some. So I would say for something like this, what social factors make people enjoy smoking marijuana? You'd be in much safer waters, recruiting marijuana users, if you can get them to show up. Sorry, bad joke. And then, interviewing them, right? Being trying to understand, what they do. Why do they smoke marijuana? In what context do they do it? What night of the week? How are they feeling when they do it? Right? Is it after a bad day at work? Interviewing them. The other one that could potentially be interesting would be some kind of ethnography. You could do deep participant observation where you're let's all smoke weed together and talk about it. That I don't think would get past ethics, but we'll talk about ethics later. Okay. What explains differential suicide rates in societies, right? So here, because you're dealing with really, really big kind of data sets, right? Suicide statistics, you'd be pulling suicide statistics and then trying to figure out what else is going on in those societies. So you're probably dealing with, some kind of survey research, and you're probably not doing your own surveys. You're probably taking a bunch of pre-existing data and analyzing it, right? But doing interviews or, focus groups probably wouldn't be that effective, right? Because you're trying to, get a big view of societies and what's going on in them. So yeah, doing interviews doesn't really make sense for that one. Suicide is one of those things that's best studied quantitatively. And then, what is it like to be a member of the furry fandom? Obviously then a survey doesn't make sense. You're wanting to talk to furries because you're what is your experience like? What's the deal with this? Why do you do this, right? Why a skunk? I don't understand. All of these sorts of things. Okay. So how are you feeling about that? Okay, almost done with this section. Okay, and when you get to the lab today, one of the things you're going to do with Celine is you're going to work kind of in groups, and you're going to come up with some research questions, right? You're going to actually try this out, and she's going to give you some feedback on your research questions. So, and if she doesn't show up, I'll be there. So, and I'll stop by at the beginning of class just to see how everyone's doing and introduce Celine as well. Okay, yeah, so the form research question is shaped by whether your methodology is quantitative or qualitative, right? So when you talk about a qualitative research question, because again, it's often you're not starting with a hypothesis, right? So you're not hypothesis testing. And so your question can't reflect a hypothesis that you have. It's going to tend to be a little bit less specific. You're probably going to end up doing something like a grounded theory approach where you're going to be developing, the project as it goes and your kind of theory as it goes. So your research question needs to be broad enough that you can sort of expand or contract the project a little bit as you start to gather data, right? So, because you're going to do that inductive kind of approach to figuring things out, right? Gather data first to figure out your theory or hypothesis from there. Okay, and then quantitative, can you use data to test the model, right? And test kind of correlations, causal models between, variables that you're gathering, right? So one of the things you want to think about, we'll talk about operationalization, is can you operationalize things like in your question, what are the variables? And can you operationalize those variables in a way that's going to allow you to test the relationship between different variables? Don't worry, we'll talk about all this. The project is going to be deductive, right? So you're principally interested in, having a hypothesis, testing it with data, gathering data with which you can test it, and then, figuring out whether your hypothesis was true or false. Typically you're dealing with a pretty narrow hypothesis in order to make it testable, right? So, I was just looking at one of these, and sociology of religion is kind of one of my areas of interest. And so I was looking at the work of a guy named Ryan Burge, really great, he's a political scientist, I'll forgive him for that. It's not his fault he didn't end up in a real discipline. No, I'm kidding, I'm sorry. But yes, also true. He was looking at a bunch of data from the the cooperative election study, trying to figure out, whether there's a link between religious service attendance and level of education. He sort of started out with the hypothesis that as level of education increases, you're going to get less religious service attendance. So he basically took the data from the cooperative election survey and tested it, using basically I did Pearson's R, but that's not important because I told you we're not going to talk about statistics. And basically what he found was it's actually the opposite, right? Actually, as education increases, religious service attendance increases as well, right? The people least likely to attend religious services are actually high school dropouts. Basically that, he had a hypothesis, he tested it with the data. It's fairly narrow, right? I'm wanting to know the relationship between these two factors, or variables. I think it's going to be this. And then you get the data and you test it. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. How are we doing? All right, class is over. No, I'm kidding. I wish. It's way too hot in here. And I know that 2 months from now, it's going to be way too cold in here. So that's where we're going to be. All right, so we're done with those slides. Good times. So now I have posted these, I'm pretty sure. Confirm? Yes, okay. Research design. It's one of those days where I'm never quite sure. In another class, I forgot something. Good times. All right, let's talk a little bit about research design. As long as you're all okay. All right, good. How about you? Have you calmed down yet? I haven't. I'm still mad. Someone told me they oversold parking and now I'm just going to be angry all day. Okay, so research design. Kind of what we were talking about 2 seconds ago, right? When we were talking about research question. Your research design is basically how are you going to collect and analyze your data, right? In terms of doing this, what is the right methodology? And then, does that match kind of the research question that you have, right? You have to put those things together. Okay, so yeah, you have to ask, what do you want to learn? So obviously, as you're formulating the research question, you should have an idea of what you want to learn. And again, think about why it's important. One of the, I always do find, as people are experimenting in this class, there's a lot of research questions where it's okay. So like, I don't know why that would be. The research question might be properly formulated, but is it important? I don't know. So think about that too. But what is it you want to learn? What kind of research question do you need to formulate in terms of getting there? What kind of explanation do you want? And we have two typical forms, nomothetic and ideographic. Okay, these are really big, ooh. Okay, my choice of color schemes on this board, not the best. Apologies for that. Can you see that okay? Not really? Okay, let me see if I can redesign that on the fly. PowerPoint gives us tools sometimes. All right, let's try that. That'll be easier. Okay, on the fly redesign. Okay, I'm good. That's easier. Okay. All right, so nomothetic explanations, right? Basically, are cause and effect kind of basically where you're expressing cause and effect relationships. Typically, expressed in terms of general laws, or what I would say mid-range theories is probably the best way of kind of thinking about this, right? Because I feel like law is maybe a little bit of a strong word, right? So basically, you're looking at typically some kind of a linkage between two things or more. It could be more than that. I shouldn't put it down to two factors because it can be, multivariate or multiple variables. But basically, you want to look at a cause and effect relationship. So already, hopefully thinking of, SOS 100 and stats, you should be thinking about, the fact that in a nomothetic kind of explanation, you're going to have typically dependent and independent variables, right? Well, and I'll tell you again what they are, what those are and how they work. But yeah, you're going to have typically a dependent variable and an independent variable, or many dependent variables, right? But typically an independent variable and things that you can manipulate or test against, right? So typically when we get in nomothetic explanations, because you're talking about the relationship between variables, you are talking about quantitative research, right? Rather than qualitative research. So nomothetic explanations have to satisfy 3 criteria of causation, right? And you should be familiar with these. Maybe. It depends how long ago and how much attention you were paying in SOS 100. And I guess who you took it with, because maybe not everybody talks about it. So maybe you aren't familiar with these. So I'll explain them. Sorry. I talk about them in SOS 100 because I'm the good SOS 100 teacher. No, I'm kidding. I have no idea. People probably are bored to tears, but that's not my fault. Or it is. I have to go rethink my life. Okay. So correlation, right? That one's pretty simple, right? You have to see a movement in your dependent variable if there's a change in your independent variable, right? So there has to be at least a kind of correlation. If you alter your independent variable, or you're testing against different ways that it was measured, and your dependent variable doesn't change, then you can't come up with you're basically, there's no relationship between the variables. So there's nothing to explain. Time order, right? So this is especially true. Actually, this can be true in a broad number of ways, actually. So basically, the change in your independent variable has to basically be correctly time ordered with the change in your dependent variable, right? So, let's say we're measuring something. Let me just think about if I can think of a factor here. Okay, let's say you want to measure the impact. You come up with a question. You want to measure the impact of populations moving to Western Canada and its relationship to housing prices in Southern Ontario, right? So basically, if what you found is that people moved to Alberta before housing prices started to rise in kind of Southern Ontario, it would fail the time order test, right? Because you're like, the thing that I thought was my independent variable, which is rising house prices in Ontario, actually came after we started to see people already moving to Western Canada, right? So that would be a kind of a failed time order, right? Because the change in the dependent variable precedes the change in your independent variable. Okay, now, however, if what you saw was, every time the housing price around Toronto rises 5%, you get the movement of about 8,000. I'm just making up numbers. These are not real numbers. You get about 8,000 people moving to, Edmonton or Calgary. And you could easily say, okay, we see first a change in housing prices and then a population movement out west. So we can easily say there that, this is time ordered, right? Change in housing prices causes the movement, so it's in the proper time order. And they can happen basically simultaneously, right? As long as your independent variable change doesn't start after the change in your dependent variable, because then whatever's changing your dependent variable is something else. It might be something like, in that example, rising energy prices on the global market, leading to better paying jobs in Alberta, so more people move out to Alberta, right? It's not related to housing prices in Toronto. So, then you would have what's called, the relationship. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna slow down. The relationship also has to be non-spurious, right? And basically, a spurious relationship means that you might have a change in your independent and dependent variable, but the thing that's really causing the change in your dependent variable is a third factor that you're probably not measuring, right? So let's say, in the example I just gave, right, you have people moving, housing prices are rising in Western Canada. Housing prices are rising in Ontario. People are moving out west. And so you're like, okay, there's a relationship here. But when let's say you do your survey and you ask, like, what was the principal, motivating factor for you moving out to Alberta? And they, cite economic opportunity, right? Or higher wages or whatever. What you would then have is basically you had a third factor that is basically the one that's leading to the population change, right? So it's like, oh, well, housing prices were rising, but that isn't what affected people's movement out to Western Canada. It was instead, higher wages or lower unemployment or whatever it happens to be, right? So that would mean that there is a relationship between, housing prices and movement out west, but it's spurious because what's actually causing the movement is this third factor, right? So it might look like there's a relationship between your two variables, but actually there isn't, right? They're not necessarily related. It's related entirely to something else. Okay, sorry, does that all make sense? Yes, good, okay. That was pretty, hopefully that's just a repeat of things you've learned before. Okay, ideographic, right? So ideographic explanations typically involve, they're written, right? So it's all words, but rich descriptions of a person or group that you're seeking to explain either a particular phenomenon or kind of the outline of that group, right? So, this is, you might think of this as like a case study, right? Where you write a really clear description of, what you found, as you donned your furry suit, right? So you sorry, I won't laugh every time I talk about furries, I promise. As you don your costume, where you take on the persona of Tom the Weasel, and you go off to the furry convention to gather your data, right? And you write up, your experience living amongst the furries, right? Which actually would be a pretty good title. I would do that, except no. So you write up your whole kind of case study of living amongst the furries, right? And you kind of describe in great detail what it's like, what your interactions were with, Wanda the skunk, how you related to people, what their how they related to each other, the reasons you learned that people do it, what the sexual culture amongst the furries is. Maybe that's chapter 5 of your PhD dissertation, sex amongst the furries, or something like that, right? That would be, so you're writing in great detail kind of aspects of this particular subculture. That would be an ideographic kind of explanation, right? Rich detail, lots of kind of information you've gathered about them. And for obvious reasons, right, this is typically qualitative, right? You're typically, telling kind of what you learned about the individual experiences or the experiences within that group in detail, trying to tell the story as fully as you can. Now, Whereas, our nomothetic explanations are often sort of meant to basically give us a theory that applies to a wide group in society, right? Society as a whole, or a particular kind of historical event or historical period, right? Ideographic explanations more typically will only apply to that particular group, and it can be hard, almost impossible most of the time to generalize, right? Like you can't. Very rarely can you take, an ideographic explanation and be like, so, because I observed this in the furries, right, this is probably what all subcultures are like, right? I suspect that, the lives of Star Trek fans or Star Wars fans or any other culture that's kind of like the furries would be, or bronies, right, would be exactly the same, right? You can't do that because you didn't study that group. So mostly what you're getting is a really deep or empathic understanding of that particular group that can't be applied outside of that group. You might be able to say something like, we should study these things in other fan cultures to see if other fan cultures share these, or subcultures share these similar kind of traits. But this is what I found, in my year living amongst the furries or whatever. Okay. Does that all make sense? Are you bored to tears? Yeah, no, please.
Kind of off topic, but the spam questions are also practice.
Can you see them still?
Yeah.
You should not be able to see those.
I didn't have to.
Please don't attempt them. I tried to make them hidden. So Oxford has done me a cruelty, and they changed how you import kind of questions into eClass. And so it made them all like part of the course. And I'm like, oh, this is not what I want. And so there's so many garbage questions in there too. Not to put too fine a point on it, but I have to delete them all and figure something out, because if you can see them, please don't try, because you shouldn't see. I thought I clicked hidden. I'll have to hide them better. But yeah, they shouldn't have imported that way, but apparently this is how Oxford thinks we should do things. It's some weird LMS package, and please don't. I'm just trying to fix it, and I realized, because I set it up to work on it last night because it took a really long time, and when I woke up this morning, it was all visible, and I'm like, oh, I really hope no one attempted these. Hide, and apparently it didn't work. But I will attempt to hide it again, or I'll delete them and figure something else out, and I'll yell at the Oxford rep because I'm in a bad mood about the parking thing. And he's gonna get my wrath. Poor Jeff, also named Jeff, and I will tear him a new one. I promise I won't. I'm actually pretty understanding, but there has to be a better way. Okay, so yes, don't attempt them. I will create practice quizzes for you, but not yet, because I'm not that organized ever in my entire life. Okay, it's very, very hot in here. Don't worry. They'll vanish before you ever find them. They're basically, I imported questions that the publisher gives for exams, and apparently they're visible and you could peruse them at your leisure, which would sort of defeat the purpose of me using them. And I'm sure Oxford would be very happy if you exported them to Chegg or some other platform, but they should have made it a better way. Okay, I'll fix that later. You're all downloading them now as we speak before I can get them down, I'm sure. Okay. You've distracted me.
Sorry.
No. I'm very distractible today. It's not your fault. Okay. Oh, okay. That time can't be right. Oh, it is. All right. Okay, so once your design is selected, right? So once you know how you're going to gather your information, right? Once you figure out what your research project looks like, you need to figure out your methodology. And like I said, these are not all the whole list. These are just examples. Questionnaires or surveys, I call them surveys. Other people call them questionnaires, are the biggest one that we use in sociology, right? Basically, the bulk of, especially quantitative research, is all questionnaires. There are other methods, and we'll talk about them, but really that's the big one, most used tool. You can have structured, semi-structured, or unstructured interviews. We'll talk about each of those in turn. Participant observation, my life amongst the furries. Ethnography, experiments. We'll talk about experiments today. Like I said last time, all the books on social methods have experiments. We don't typically use them in sociology. We leave that to lesser disciplines like psychology. No, I'm kidding. Or political science. They can have that one too. No, poli-sci doesn't use it. But yeah, experiments we don't typically do. We'll talk a little bit about experiments and why we don't use them today. But you want to figure out, and so I will say this. When you are writing, I know we're going to talk about them today, right? And we're going to talk about them in this class. When you are designing your research project, hopefully you've looked at the major lab one and what's kind of expected of you. If not, maybe we'll look at that. I'll go over it with you next class just to kind of give you an idea. But it's all there on eClass along with every question I could possibly use for the exams. But as you're thinking about it, don't think of one that uses an experiment, because what you're going to get from me, and this happens all the time, right? So I'm trying to be very clear about it. Don't do an experiment simply for this reason. We don't do experiments in sociology. Why? Because they are kind of inherently flawed, right? In terms of understanding the social world. Whatever psychologists study, it might be effective to do experimental designs for them, but most sociologists don't want to. So don't write me one where you're like, I'm going to stick people in a lab and I'm going to give them an electrical shock every time they try to reach for the cookie. Because A, that's not a sociological experiment, and B, that's mean. But don't do a lab-based exam or kind of idea, because while we will talk about them, we don't do them in sociology very often. So just a note for you. I can tell you that because I think most people are here today. Okay, so experiments and experimental design. Yeah, so experiments, like I said, are common in psychology and organizational studies, but rare in sociology or poli-sci, or like another social science like economics, right? We don't see them a lot, specifically because what we're really interested in as sociologists is people in their natural social environment, not, what happens, if you manipulate variables in a particular way to cause a particular scenario, right? Those might be interesting, but not for sociologists. Okay. Yeah, lots of kind of general problems with experiments, right? A lot of times, many things that could be causing part of your relationship between variables, many variables of interest aren't subject to experimental kind of manipulation. And so unless your lab design is really, really good, you can see a lot of spurious relationships. And I will say, I think these kinds of lab-based psychology studies are at the moment in a bit of what's called a replication crisis. That's how I felt coming to class today. I don't know if anyone's talked to you about the replication crisis, particularly in psychology, but one of the things that we found is almost nobody is attempting to redo studies anymore. And when people kind of do attempt to kind of redo a lot of the experimental designs, most of them fail on the second go, right? Because basically whoever set up the experiment set it up in such a way as to get the result that they already wanted, right? And ignored other variables that might be kind of intervening, right? So, so one of the famous ones for this, you've probably heard about this one, is, the marshmallow test, right? Where they basically, you've heard about it, you're nodding. The marshmallow test, right, where they took, I think, preschoolers, and they basically, put a big gooey marshmallow in front of them, and they said, you can either eat the marshmallow right now, or in 5 minutes when I come back, you can have 2 marshmallows or whatever. I don't remember the exact bounds of the experiment, but I think it was something like that, right? And basically then they took the kids who, controlled themselves and didn't eat the marshmallow, and the kids who ate the marshmallow, and they basically tracked them over the years, and, the conclusion they came to was, well, the people who ate the marshmallow and didn't wait for the second one, they demonstrate lower levels of self-control, and, they don't do as well in life and the people who showed delayed gratification had better life outcomes. Now, as people have tried to go back and test this experiment, they've found all sorts of random weird variables, right? So the original researchers didn't control for race, right? They didn't control for economic kind of circumstances. And as people started to take those variables into account, they're like, actually, the marshmallow thing is much less kind of predictive than, you know, where the kid comes from in terms of their social background. So sociologists destroyed the marshmallow thing. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. And that is the problem with a lot of these experimental designs, right? Is you might be so focused on, like, you get tunnel vision a little bit, and you might be so focused on what's the relationship between self-control and life success that you measure those two things and fail to measure a bunch of other things. And that's sort of the story of that marshmallow experiment in a nutshell. Okay, so those might be interesting. They might, and you might not measure them because you're not thinking about it. And so experimental designs often kind of fail for that reason. Okay, I mean, that was a weird one because it's like experimental and longitudinal, but never mind. Let's not talk about it anymore. No more marshmallow thing. All right, ethical concerns preclude performing certain experiments. I mean, we'll talk about research ethics coming up, but this has become an increasingly important kind of area that you have to think about when you're doing research. Because anytime, like, you know, if you do an honors thesis that involves people, if you do a master's where you're studying people, or PhD, or any kind of research where human subjects are involved, basically you have to go, well, I mean, you don't stand before the ethics board. You send a proposal to the research ethics board, and they have to approve it, right? And anything that could, we'll talk about the criteria for what you're allowed to do a little bit later, but a lot of ethical concerns could preclude you from doing experiments, right? So anything that could potentially be harmful to the subjects is inherently, you're not going to be allowed to do it. You have to have a whole bunch of mitigation strategies and tools in order to kind of justify being able to do the project, right? So a lot of things, you know, in experimental design, like some of the early experiments that were done in kind of lab settings are absolutely wild, and they would never, ever pass research ethics today, right? So if you've heard about the one where it's like, there's people in two rooms separated by glass, and the one person is told to push a button, and they think that they're giving an electrical shock to the person in the other room. And then they, like, a lot of people just keep doing it because they're being told to do it. And then by the end, they think they've like horribly harmed the person on the other side because they're all like, you know, or something. Probably more realistic than that. That's terrible acting. That's like, yeah, Riverdale levels of acting right there. That would never be, and a lot of people kind of came away with like trauma because they thought they'd harmed the person on the other side of the glass. You would never be allowed to do that today, right? Because, you know, you can't put someone in a situation where they could potentially experience harm that's not really justifiable, you know, in terms of what you're going to learn and the value of it. There are some, and I get ahead of myself, but there's some circumstances where you could potentially lie to people about what you're studying, but you have to debrief them afterwards. All sorts of like really complicated things with ethics, right? So deception is out, you know, harm is out. So a lot of kind of things that you would try to learn in a lab might not potentially be that interesting because you can only find out interesting things when you hurt people. No, I'm sorry, I'm kidding. But, you know, there's a lot of things that are, someone might see, well, potentially you could traumatize someone, or you could bring up things from their past, or there's a whole list of things, right? You could put them in danger. They might be recognized, right? Or all sorts of things like that. And so ethical concerns are going to take out a lot of experiments. Yeah, this one, right? The marshmallow thing again. Yeah, lots of phenomena of interest have long-term complex causes that can't be simulated in experiments, right? So sometimes experiments are just kind of useless, especially when it comes to the social world, right? Yeah, and even when applicable, you know, experimental models don't get at the perceptions and feelings of the subject, or they don't get enough in depth into what people are actually thinking. So if you've ever taken, what is it, like Psych 107 or Psych 108, right? And part of it is which I think is unethical actually, but one of the things you can do for extra credit or for 2% is you get to participate in some grad student psych experiment, right? Right? I remember the one I did when I did intro psych, and it was like sit in a room with heavy metal music and try to solve math problems. And I'm like, well, okay. I guess it's not easy, right? With Metallica, like going like. Anyway, I do remember this, and I'm like, what the hell were you trying to learn from this? And didn't really get into, my perceptions or feelings. Like, I didn't care. I was like, I'm here for credit. I'm just going to sit here and do like 3 math problems and listen to Metallica for a bit and then leave. It didn't really get into my perceptions. And they're like, oh, this person did horrible on this math test. He must be really dumb. Several years later, I got a PhD, and I'm making fun of that experiment because that experiment was dumb, even though I have no idea what they were trying to figure out. Probably something like, what is the effect of different kinds of music on people's ability to do math? If they'd known my inherent math skills, they, like, could you give us your grade 12 math grades? That would probably have been a good thing to ask. Anyway, right? Complex causes, I stink. I'm better now, but I stunk at math in my undergrad. It didn't really tell them anything about why I was there, why I was doing things, how I felt about math, how I felt about being dragged to this experiment because I wanted 2% of my grade or something like that. So, it had inherent kind of flaws, and I will mock it for till the end of my career. Okay. 2 kind of experiments. Field experiments conducted in real life surroundings, right? So I'm trying to think of real life experiments. And the one that I can think about as a kind of example, one you'll talk about in the lab, I think later on, is like the subway violinist experiment, right? So basically, this is one where basically they take like a concert violinist, and they put them down in like the New York subway, and they're playing the violin. And in one scenario, they have him dressed basically in like, the garb of a homeless person. And the other one, he's dressed in like a tuxedo. And then on the way out, they try to like talk to people and ask like what they thought of this person's, or maybe that one, I don't know if they do a debrief. I can't remember the exact bounds of the experiment. I think that one they like observed how people reacted to the person, and then maybe debrief them at the end and ask what they thought of the person, right? Same violinist, different outfit. What's people's reaction to kind of social clothing, right? So that's out in the world, right? It's in the subway station in New York City. And so it's, a field experiment. There's other ones, right, where they like put piano keys on a staircase. And when people step on them, it makes it, up in a subway station or something. When people step on them, it makes a note. And then they observe how people act, right? What would making like a public space funner? How would people interact with that space in those scenarios, right? But you're talking about a real world situation. Laboratory experiments, basically it's like what I was describing from my undergrad, right? They stuck me in a room playing heavy metal music and, said solve these calculus equations. In that case, right, it's a controlled research environment, easier to randomly assign research subjects. So you have higher validity, easier to replicate. External validity, right? What does it tell you about the real world? Almost nothing, because you're creating such an artificial scenario. So those are 2 major kinds of lab experiments. Okay. Sorry, just checking the time. Okay. So, experimental design, kind of key things that you need to think about, right? Basically your experimental group or treatment group, right? Who gets the treatment or manipulation of some kind, right? Versus a control group, where you don't get a treatment, right? So potentially in my lab experiment, they might have had, people come into the room and been like, hey, here's a sheet of math problems. Could you complete those math problems? And there's no music, right? So they just see how people do in a normal, non-stressful environment. And then you might have, an experimental or several experimental groups, right? Then you put someone like me in the room and you play heavy metal music and you see how they perform on the test, right? Or how they act or whatever. I still don't know what they were trying to figure out. I wonder if I could find out. Probably not. Seeing as I have no idea who did the experiment or anything like that at this point. Although I think I still have a box of all my undergraduate notes, so maybe it's somewhere in there. But I have so much time on my hands to go find out. All right, so yeah, you have your experimental group, one that receives some kind of manipulation, your control group, which doesn't, right? So no music versus music while you try to solve experiments. Yeah, random assignment, basically, in order so that you don't, put a particular group of people, excuse me, the UPS store wants to tell me my package is in, good to know. Yeah, so that you don't get a particular group of people just going in, like, I guess you can't select the group of people that you put into the experiment to get certain results, right? A good experiment should have a random control group, random assignment, right? So you assign people randomly based on nothing, right? You don't know anything about them. You just assign them randomly, hoping that, you get a kind of representative sample. When we talk about surveys as well, random assignment in surveys is important as well, because you don't want to bias your sample by picking certain people, right? By picking a certain grouping, right? So there's lots of, and we'll talk about this. It's really important, but I won't talk about it just yet. It is really, really important to have random assignment, both in kind of lab experiments and in surveys if you can, right? Okay, and then pre-test, you measure of the dependent variable before the experimental manipulation, right? And post-test measurement of it, after the manipulation. So maybe, right, I don't know, again, I'm now making things up. You let me do 3 math problems before you turn on the heavy metal music, and then afterwards you turn on the heavy metal music and see how long it takes me to solve 3 math problems, right? So you kind of pre-test, like, what's my baseline, and then post-test, after you put in the experiment. But again, we don't do this in sociology very much. All right, so yeah, you got your independent variable, right? Which is your presumed cause in a cause and effect relationship. I know you all know this, but we'll just review so that we're all clear on it. Right, so, and basically, right, so how you want to know how your cause influences the effect, right? So obviously in this experiment, I've got on this graphic, right? You're curious about how caffeine intake would influence the number of words recalled, right? So probably you gave people, like, in an experiment like this, it's like, give them caffeine or not caffeine if they're in the control group. Give them a random list of words and see how many words they could remember, right? It's kind of a weird, they do this in cognitive testing too, for elderly people, to remember, to see how cognitively with it they are. Okay, so yeah, basically, causality underpins different types of research design in social science, both quantitative and qualitative, though mostly quantitative, right? When we're talking about, cause and effect, you can talk about this in qualitative terms, but mostly we're talking about quantitative terms, right? We're talking about one variable affecting the other, right? And, obviously lab design is easy to think about that because you're introducing it. Sometimes when you're talking about statistical work, right, you're looking at, okay, as, your independent variable might be something that you're not manipulating, but that you can check at different levels of it what happens to another piece of data, right? So like I was mentioning earlier in the class, you could look at something like, okay, how does level of education affect religious service attendance, right? So you'd say, okay, my independent variable is level of education, so I'm going to take people without a high school diploma. Okay, and then you kind of look at what their level of religious service attendance is, how many attend weekly, right? And then you're like, okay, so now let's look at, people with a PhD. What's that level, right? So maybe I went high school there and I went PhD there. It's very classist of me. I'm a terrible person. So that's how an independent variable works in kind of statistics, right? You're measuring it at different levels, and then seeing how it correlates to your dependent variable. Okay, so you can do this like in all sorts of ways, right? Yeah, so I say I'm talking about this. It's often expressed in the language of variables. It's always expressed in the almost always expressed in the language of variables, right? Characteristics are attributes of data that vary or change, right? Yeah, gender, age, interest in a subject, belief, action, right? All sorts of things. We'll talk about this when we talk about operationalization too. Okay, because I define things before I get to the slides. Independent variables are manipulated to see if they impact the dependent variable, right? So it's the cause and effect relationship. Right, dependent outcome, like headache pain, the independent one is like taking Tylenol, right? So your theory here would probably be, and this is a biomedical one, but it kind of works. Right, so independent variable is taking, so people who have headaches, you give them headache medicine. Your hypothesis is probably that, an hour later, they're going to rate their headache as getting better. And so you can measure, like, did their headache get better when they took extra strength Tylenol, right? And you can that's your relationship, right? And again, like I said, you can do this in so many kind of measurements, right? You can look at income, income versus happiness, right? So basically, as people get richer, do they say that they're happier, right? Or, social class, and like length of marriages, right? You could be like, okay, does the social class, like, is someone working class? Are they poor? Are they middle class? Are they rich? Does that affect how long people tend to remain married? And you can do this, right, in so many ways, looking at how one variable, your independent, affects your dependent variable, right? So millions of examples, and it'll be your job in your kind of research proposals, especially the first one that's quantitative, to think through and be like, okay, what variable do I want to say, like, what's the effect on this one of this one, right? And again, there's lots of possibilities. Could be like body image in teenage girls versus, how is body image dependent affected by hours spent on Instagram, right? You can do all of those sorts of things. How you measure that could be a little tricky, but we can work on figuring that out at a later date. Does that all make sense? I haven't checked in a minute. Does that all make sense? I know you're probably like, we have all heard this a billion times. Please go faster. But you can actually say that if you feel like it. Okay. Yeah, so classic experimental design. You identify your independent and dependent variables. You kind of operationalize them. How are you going to measure them? You observe them, right? Pre-test and post-test at time one. And then basically, sorry, the last one. You receive, the treatment group gets the treatment, the control group doesn't, and you see kind of what the effect is, presumably. But like I said, we don't need to worry about experiment too much, because we're not going to, you will not rate them. Okay. Dependent variable is observed post-test in each of the control and treatment groups recorded at time 2. Right, so you introduce your independent variable at time 1. You measure the effect at time 2, and any changes are noted. Right, but like I said, we're not gonna worry about those. And that's, this kind of would often be kind of written up like this. This is kind of what a classic experimental design looks like. So yeah. Oh, this is one of these weird ones that was done in a classroom. I recognize it by the language. Because this is a graphic from the textbook. Yeah, so basically, right, this was this kind of experiment where basically what they did was they gave students in a school an IQ test, but it was fake. And they reported the results to the teachers, right? And basically, they classed based on the results they made up. So basically, they just randomly classed some students as spurters, like kids that could blast ahead, very smart, and non-spurters, just regular kids. And then they told the teachers that this was what they had found. And basically, what they said was, so 8 months later, they kind of looked at how those kids were doing. And basically what they said is that those that they had classed as spurters, right, teachers treated more especially, gave more attention to, and therefore, their school marks had actually gone up. and those that were classed as non-spurters, that was their control group, there were no teacher expectation that these kids were really special, and they basically stayed right where they were. So, I mean, because these were randomly assigned, right? They didn't take like the smartest kids because the IQ test was fake. They took a bunch of random kids, and all of the kids showed improvement, right? So basically, you introduce your variable, which is you lie to the teacher, and you tell them that this kid is super smart, and you lie to the teacher and tell them this kid is average. And then basically you watch what happens as the teacher's expectations that this kid is smart. How does it affect them 8 months later, right? That's a pretty classic experimental design. Whether it's ethical, I don't know actually. Okay. So ideally, changes only occur in your treatment group. If changes occur in both groups, then your relationship is obviously spurious, right? It's not your independent variable causing the change. Yeah, true experimental evidence should eliminate all other rival explanations for the change. Like I said, with the marshmallow experiment, this doesn't always happen. And sometimes this is just human fallacy, right? We can't see all the possible factors that might be affecting someone's life, right? Especially if you go beyond just the lab. And yeah, most social experience is complex, and therefore, you know, it's hard to do in terms of these kinds of research projects. Yeah, it's hoped that the control group and random distribution increases internal validity, right? That you get a kind of random sample. Again, this doesn't always work because sometimes it depends where you're located, who you can recruit. And so it's not always, you know, possible to get a kind of truly random sample. So internal validity is always a bit of a problem with lab design. Okay. How are we doing for time? Is it actually 12:15? No, 12:10. Okay, I got 10 minutes. Okay. It is a Tuesday, Thursday class. It's an hour and a half. Okay, good. I did this last year where I was like, oh, we got lots of time, but it was a Monday, Wednesday, 1 hour class. And at the hour mark, people are packing up. I'm like, wait, aren't we keeping it? Oh, no. I forget things sometimes. Okay, so validity in social research. Basically, you're measuring whether the study or the kind of research you did actually addresses what you were intending to address, right? So basically, did you measure the right thing, or did you measure the wrong thing, right? Did you actually get what you were trying to measure, right? Yeah, so basically, internal validity, right? Concerned with the extent to which what's interpreted as the cause in the cause and effect relationship, right, of any actual changes is actually what caused it, right? In other words, it's about the extent that whether the research design is a good test of the hypothesis, right? So is your, basically, are you measuring the right thing? In measuring your independent variable, are you actually measuring properly what caused the effect that you're observing, right? So basically, did a study to establish a person's income level, that a person's income level in Canada is influenced by level of education. Could it be influenced by something else, right? So that example, right? You could potentially have a situation, say, where you're like, oh, income level in Canada is influenced by level of education, right? And you find that, yes, actually income level is affected. People with a college degree tended to have more income than people without a college degree, right? But what could potentially be, an intervening factor? Let's say that socioeconomic background, right, is an intervening factor in that. The level of income actually is more associated with how wealthy your parents are, right? So then you would have, basically, you would have measured, level of income kind of properly, but you would have missed what's actually causing it, right? So you would have low validity in that case, right? So you might have, like, say, this target, right? You might have a kind of reliable conclusion, right? You find that people with a college education have a higher level of income, but you sort of missed the target because what actually caused it was parental kind of background, right? Or socioeconomic class that the person comes from, right? Because you might have outliers, in your data, which you wouldn't see on a chart like this. But if you say took like a dot chart, you might have people who have a college degree but income is way lower because they come from a lower socioeconomic background. But yeah, I mean, basically, internal validity. Did you actually measure the right thing? Did your research design actually capture what's actually going on? Or did you see an effect, but you were measuring the wrong thing, right? You were measuring kind of the wrong independent variable. Okay. So, Cook and Campbell, 1979, outlined some threats to internal validity in experiments that lack random assignment or the presence of a control group, right? Okay, so like if you, for whatever reason, we're doing a kind of, even a survey or an experimental design where you didn't have, random assignment or a control group, you can have a bunch of stuff that kind of gets in your way. So history, right? Some events occurring after the treatment was given may have influenced the dependent variable, right? So in the marshmallow experiment, right? Maybe something that happened after the kids were given the marshmallow test might, okay, actually, sorry, that's a bad example. The teacher example, right? Wait, that was the actual experimental design. Sorry, I'm going to go back to the marshmallow one, right? History, right? Maybe something happens afterwards, right? Like a huge government grant comes into the neighborhood where all those kids were from, right? And it's like No Child Left Behind comes in, and it just happens that it picks up most of the kids that were living in one neighborhood where, that was where all the kids who waited for the second marshmallow were, and it actually caused a change because they got tutoring or something like that, right? So history could affect it if you don't have a control group, right? Testing, the pretest can affect the dependent variable, right? So sometimes this is like people know they're being experimented on. So like if you're doing an experimental design, sometimes the first thing you do is a kind of pretest to see where people are. Maybe you gave them, say, 10 math, like in my terrible example of the project that I imagined someone was doing to me. They gave me 10 math problems with no music on, and then they turned on Metallica and saw if I could do 10 more problems. But by the time, I got to the second 10 problems, I was getting mentally fatigued. And so and that was the case, right? Most people did worse on the second one, but not because of, because their pretest kind of tired me out in that case, right? So you could have a situation like that where you're actually your pretest actually causes a change because you're trying to establish someone's baseline, but in establishing someone's baseline, you actually change the way they're behaving, or you tire them out, or they start to try to please you, right? And this happens sometimes in experimental designs, right? People try to figure out what you're trying to test, and they try to give it to you because they want to make you happy or something like that. So pretest can affect things. Yeah, instruments, right? Changes in the way a test is administered can account for pre and post-test differences. This can happen too, especially in long studies, right? So something like where you wait a couple of years for someone to see an effect, right? So you test the IQ of students at, when they're in kindergarten, and you use like a pen and paper exam. But then technology advances, and when they get to the end of high school and you retest those same people, you're giving it to them on iPads, right? And the method of collection of that data might actually affect things. Mortality, depending on the length of things, right? And how, hopefully if you're doing like a short study, nobody dies during your study. But, if you're doing, say, a longitudinal design where you want to, say, track people over a period of time, people leave the experiment before it's over. So yeah, I mean, that sometimes happens, right? It can be hard to find people again. Like, say you tested them when they were in kindergarten, and you want to test them again when they get through high school, but then they move to Kentucky, rural Kentucky, and left no forwarding address, and you can't find them, right? So participants leave or die before the experiment is over, right? And that happens, right? I was just talking with this is not an experiment, it's actually a longitudinal kind of research study with Harvey Cron, who was the chair of our department a few years ago. He's retired now. And they started surveying a group of people when they got out of high school in like 1978. and they keep surveying them again every 4 years. And he was talking about this, how, yeah, now they've had like people who've actually died that were in the, like the sample was initially like 800 people and is now down to 550 because they've lost track of people, and people have actually now started to, to pass away for various medical conditions. So mortality, right? People leave or die in the experiment before it's over, or as you're still measuring. You wanted to see, what the effect of giving them a marshmallow in kindergarten was on their high school graduation rate, but you lose track of them. Okay, maturation. Participants change over time. Potentially, something that you were measuring when they were younger might not still make sense. As they go through life changes, they themselves change their views or change all sorts of things, right? Maturation can play a role. And then post-test differences between control and experimental group could be caused by pre-existing differences. This was the marshmallow test, right? Where, the kids who did better and had better self-control actually came from a higher socioeconomic strata. And it's something that the researchers didn't think about. They thought it was sort of some inherent personality thing, and it wasn't. So, the selection, if you're not careful with your selection, you can actually kind of miss factors that could be there. Okay, I think I'm out of time now. So out of time. We'll talk about measurement validity next time. We'll keep going with this. Again, if you're in the Tuesday lab today, 2 till 4 in Torrey, basement 39, I will be there on time this time. Put that in there.